heading to the Arctic for seals in 1826. In St. Petersburg, a 4-volume set titled Library of Famous Men was published, long considered a bibliographic rarity. Its coverage was impressive, ranging from Magellan's Straits to Captain Cook's latest discoveries in Oceania. Concerning the North, it was represented in 2 articles, one of which narrated the seal hunting expeditions off the coast of Greenland in the latter half of the 18th century. This material struck me as particularly fascinating. The account of the voyage to Greenland on the seal hunting vessel Herman was recorded in 1778, immediately after the rescued sailors returned to Europe. The author of the article mentions that he had spoken with a native of Hamburg, Heinrich Roseland, who had found employment as a ship's carpenter last April. Although most of the Herman's crew were Germans, the skipper of the vessel was Danish. Heinrich writes that the schooner was maintained by the widow of the late Abraham Willings. It appears that this enterprising widow was not only the ship's owner but also intended to profit from the whale and seal trade. Heinrich does not specify the port from which the vessel embarked on its hunting expedition, but he does mention the Elbe River. Thus, the Herman set sail from Hamburg and, within 2 weeks, reached Spitzbergen, where the most profitable seal hunting occurred at that time of year. Here, we found many ships that had arrived here well before us and were successfully engaged in their business, writes our hero. Our catch was also good, as in a very short time, we obtained more than 1,200 weight of seal blubber. However, the prime seal hunting season was missed, and the Herman headed northwest, where they could engage in whaling. In fact, not a day went by without the crew spotting sperm whales. The sailors harpooned these mammals directly from the deck, but the whales pulled the lines out and escaped. The crew felt offended that their Dutch counterparts were returning laden with whale blubber. On the other hand, Heinrich noted that the conditions of the voyage that year were exceedingly harsh, to the point where the crew hoped the skipper would turn the ship southwards, heading for home. However, the skipper was bound by the orders given by the ship's owner, so the hunt continued. In an attempt to reach the Greenland coast, the ship navigated through ice floes for 3 weeks. Most of the whaling ships had left this treacherous place, and only 4 schooners occasionally appeared on the horizon. One stormy night, the ice closed in around all the ships. Now, each crew was seeking refuge and trying to escape to open water. Often, we had to stand still in one place for whole days, fearing to freeze one. Heinrich reminisced. In this hopeless situation, we sailed from September onwards, not knowing where we were. Finally, we emerged into open water and found ourselves at the entrance to Davis Strait II. During this prolonged voyage, we often had to contend with fierce storms and raging waves, but Providence watched over us for a long time. However, suddenly all our hopes vanished. Both our ship and the other 4, which had once again joined us, were unexpectedly smashed by enormous ice floes. There was only one lifeboat on the Herman, which they had to lower onto the ice, load with supplies, and haul themselves. Along the way right on the ice, the sailors stumbled upon another lifeboat, abandoned by unknown individuals. In it lay 2 sacks of biscuits and a barrel of oil. Apparently, after the shipwreck, the crew of the Herman had scattered in different directions, as the narrator reports that they encountered 10 of their own sailors, whom they had been forced to abandon to their fate. Then, both lifeboats were launched into the water, and the sailors set off blindly, risking being crushed by the ice at any moment. Not even having covered a mile, we saw about 25 people from our crew on a large ice floe, who were crying out to us with tears, begging us to save them from impending death. Heinrich related, but we couldn't help them. Soon after, another 13 people drifted past us on a thick ice floe. During the day, a strong wind came up, and the crew had to venture onto the ice along with the lifeboat. That's where they made their first camp, a mountain on the horizon. The next day, after covering 13 miles, they spotted an ice mountain in the distance. Opinions were divided. Some said it was unreachable, while others demanded that the boat be directed toward the mountain. However, soon, the waves drove the Herman crew back onto the ice, forcing them once again to haul the boat themselves. By that time, the crew's situation had become critical because their provisions were running out. Heinrich briefly describes those dreadful days. He only mentions that the lifeboats served as their tables and chairs during the day and makeshift tents at night. Clearly, they overturned the boats at night to climb inside the hulls, trying to find some warmth. It can be said with certainty that if it weren't for the lifeboats, which provided excellent wind protection, no one from the Herman crew would have survived in the Arctic. As for the ice mountain in the north, the sailors did not know if they could reach it on their already damaged lifeboats. To avoid disagreements, Heinrich called over an elderly boatswain, whom he recommended as an experienced, brave, and wise man, and asked if it might be better to head to the visible mountain across the ice. The boatswain approved of the idea, as it was better than perishing amidst the ice floes at sea. Here, Heinrich mentions a certain Captain Dresden, who refused to follow the Herming crew. From this, it can be inferred that the crews of two ships found themselves on the ice. However, soon Dresden went in search of his fortune on the water. The crew of the latter, or rather, what remained of it, decided to reach land on the lifeboats. Before parting ways, the sailors divided the remaining bread equally. In the end, Heinrich and his comrades became exhausted, dragging the lifeboat behind them. So, they abandoned it and, each taking an oar, set off across the ice towards the towering mountain visible on the horizon. They spent the first night sleeping on the oars, fearing that their clothing would freeze to the ice. In the morning, they resumed their odyssey through the white silence, with the crucial difference that there was hardly any bread left. This significantly weakened the unfortunate souls, and the farther they progressed, the slower they moved. On the way, the sailors spent approximately 4 days on their journey. Our hero explains that such slow progress was due to their weakened condition and the frequent need to navigate around thin ice floes, as falling into the water was a constant risk. During the last 3 nights, the sailors hardly slept because they often had to get up and walk on the ice to avoid freezing. Finally, the crew reached the base of the mountain. Heinrich describes it as extremely tall and steep, entirely covered with smooth ice. The sailors hoped to climb the mountain to survey the surroundings and determine their next move. However, the ice on all sides of the mountain was equally impassable. Nevertheless, Heinrich's comrades decided to attempt the ascent. Before this, they lightened their load by consuming all the bread and using some of the saved oil for sustenance. Then we began to climb the mountain, recalls Heinrich. The old boatswain led the way and showed us the path. I was the very last, as I felt strong enough to support the weak ones who kept slipping. After indescribable efforts, we successfully reached the summit of the mountain, which was entirely barren and sterile. People wanted to go to sleep immediately, but our hero persuaded them to gather firewood and make a fire, which he admits was more necessary than sleep. The carpenter's suggestion was accepted, and soon everyone warmed themselves and dried their clothes over the fire. Meanwhile, the boatswain went somewhere without saying a word. However, he soon returned, to our great joy, with a full cap of Greenland salad. A stroke of luck was that one of the sailors had kept a small kettle, which was now more valuable than gold. They cooked the salad in it, marking their first hot meal since the shipwreck. Greenlanders. After wandering along the coast for several hours, the sailors reached a small area covered in green grass. Here, they offered heartfelt thanks to merciful Providence for their miraculous deliverance. Heinrich writes that they soon became convinced that they were in Greenland. In various places, the sailors saw low bushes with berries that the boatswain called cranberries. Learning that they were edible, everyone eagerly feasted on the berries. This added some variety to their diet. Now, for lunch, the crew had cooked cranberries, and for dinner, they had salad. On the following day, they swapped the dishes. The rescued crew spent 4 days in this clearing. Although it was calmer than being on the ice, they needed to decide where to go next. Their only hope of returning home rested on the assumption that there were people on this shore who traded with Europeans. However, after 4 days, the crew of the Herman had not discovered a single human trace, almost extinguishing this hope. Greenlanders. One evening, the sailors heard an unusual noise behind a cliff that no one could explain. It continued throughout the night, piquing their curiosity even more. At dawn, the sailors vowed to each other not to part and to share dangers together and immediately headed toward the source of the noise. Climbing the cliff, they saw that the noise came from the waves crashing against icy cliffs. From above, they could see that the land they were almost separated from the rest by a wide strait. To the north, enormous ice mountains loomed. Thus, the sailors realized they were on a small island. Heinrich writes that upon witnessing this dismal sight, the boatswain was the only one who did not lose heart. He told his comrades to expect the arrival of the natives, who would eventually appear and lead them to Europeans. Returning to their clearing, the sailors set about making camp. They fashioned something akin to a tent from their oars, using them as supports. What served as the tent, Heinrich does not specify. As soon as this fragile shelter was ready, a cry rang out. It was one of the sailors who had spotted the natives in their kayaks out at sea. Here, our storyteller provides a description of a Greenlandic kayak. A kayak, hence the term kayak, is a small boat used by the natives in Greenland. Typically, only one person sits in the kayak, and it is laced up in such a way that it does not get swamped by waves. Even if the kayak capsizes, the kayaker instantly rights it, returning it to its normal height. Heinrich adds that the native carries several harpoons and darts with which to hunt whales, seals, and seabirds. Upon spotting the Greenlanders, the sailors began waving their handkerchiefs and shouting at the top of their lungs to beckon them closer. However, the natives hastily distanced themselves. The wise boatswain explained the Greenlanders' actions to the crew. He said they had gone in search of reinforcements, sensing their vulnerability against foreigners. And he was correct. Just half an hour later, 6 kayaks appeared from behind the cape, swiftly approaching the shore. Seeing people, we were overjoyed. Heinrich writes, but we didn't know how to convey who we were and what we desired. We noticed that one of the Greenlanders was wearing a colorful hat, common in Alton 4, and immediately concluded that they had connections with Europeans. Although the Greenlander in the hat didn't know a single European word, he turned out to be the cleverest of them all. The sailors used gestures to explain to him that they had come from the country where they made similar hats, that they had lost their ship, and were now dying from cold and hunger. The Greenlander understood the sailors very well. He asked them for an oar, gave it to one of his companions, and instructed him to paddle to the village. Soon, 7 or 8 kayaks arrived from there, in which they accommodated the rescued sailors. The villagers were already waiting for the sailors. Several Greenlanders were busy preparing fresh fish and seal meat. They were preparing all of this for us as if we were long-awaited guests. Heinrich writes, and when we satisfied our hunger, they put us to sleep on beds made of seal skin, which also serves the local residents for clothing and footwear. On the following day, the sailors made every effort to convey to their host that they were friends of the Danes and other neighboring peoples. However, all their efforts were in vain. The Greenlanders couldn't understand the sailors. By a stroke of luck, someone found a scrap of paper in their pocket on which Heinrich had drawn a ship with a boat attached to it, from which several people were throwing harpoons at whales. Showing this picture to our host, I tried to make him understand whether people from their region lived there or whether people came there in such vessels, and whether he could take us to them. He immediately tucked the picture behind his ear, put on his colorful hat, and through gestures, indicated to us that he would set out on a journey tomorrow and would soon return to us with an answer. The Greenlander kept his word. Returning on the 3rd day, he brought each of the sailors a few biscuits, a small pot of oil, and a bottle of wine. However, what delighted Heinrich and his companions the most was a letter, half of which was written in Danish, and the other half in German. A certain Mr. Kammerfeld invited them aboard his ship. As a sign of gratitude to their host, the sailors gifted him with more than a dozen bone vest buttons, which he had long admired. The next day, the rescued sailors were accommodated in a large boat, which was taken to the colony where Europeans live. The Kammerfeld family consisted of 3 men and 2 women. Upon meeting the sailors, he asked in German where they were from. When they announced that they were natives of Hamburg, he joyfully embraced them and then led them into his home, where he treated them very well. Kammerfeld asked them to tell him about their adventures and inquired about what had happened to the other sailors from the Hermit. Had any of them been saved on these shores? Learning that this couldn't be ruled out and that several other ships had perished nearby, Kammerfeld immediately sent a Greenland native to search for people. This man had converted to Christianity and remained in the colony in service. However, the messenger returned soon after with the news that he hadn't seen anyone anywhere. On the following morning, the baptized Greenlander once again set off in his kayak along the coast. By midday, he unexpectedly returned with news that he had seen 5 Europeans on a cliff who, it seemed to him, were near death. The host instructed his servant to take the boat and rescue these people. When the boat returned, to the sailors' surprise, they recognized the 5 unfortunate individuals as Captain Andresen and his 4 officers, who had been with them on the ice after the shipwreck. They endured even more than we did, Heinrich writes, because upon reaching the shore, they found neither salad nor cranberries like we did, but had to make do with a small quantity of stale bread they had left. Kammerfeld warmly hosted the newcomers for several more days, until the new guests had fully recovered. Then, apologizing that he couldn't support them any longer, he sent the rescued men in a large boat with enough bread to a Danish merchant who traded with Greenland. A recommendation letter had been prepared in advance. The boat safely reached the Danish colony known as Julianeham. The arriving sailors were taken to a wealthy merchant whose company had 4 accountants. According to Heinrich, the merchant received them very well and provided them with excellent accommodations. Here, the sailors saw a Danish trading ship in the harbor, which had recently picked up several crew members from the Herman who were stranded on the ice. In addition to this, Greenlanders occasionally brought other sailors to Julianahab, whose ships had also perished. Within a few days, the colony had gathered 53 survivors. The generous merchant generously rewarded the rescued sailors, giving each of them 7 seal skins and 6 pounds of tobacco. Some of the tobacco was intended for the Greenlanders, who immediately started sewing new clothes for the sailors to replace the rags their sea attire had become. Heinrich noted that the local women who were tailoring for the sailors were passionate hunters of strong tobacco. Unfortunately, Heinrich didn't leave a detailed description of Julianahab. He only mentioned that the colony had its own Lutheran priest. It's not surprising that the first thing the sailors did was to visit the local church, where they partook in the holy sacraments of Christ. The sailors spent the entire winter in Julianahab, and as soon as navigation allowed, the Danish ship left Greenland, taking the rescued men on board. Heinrich dates their departure from Greenland as April 6, 1788. The first port the sailors saw was the Norwegian city of Bergen. From there, they each made their way back to their respective homelands. To conclude his account of this Arctic odyssey, the ship's carpenter testifies that out of the 53 surviving sailors, 3 died along the way, while the remaining 50 safely returned home. In the ghost ship returning to the question of the shipwreck of the Herman, one may wonder, what happened to the ships trapped in the ice? Of course, most of them would receive holes and sink as the ice crushed them. Others would become frozen in the ice, lose stability over time, tip over, and eventually sink. However, there were also those that froze in place, became covered in frost, and, like ghosts, moved along with the Arctic ice, terrifying passing whalers. One such case was recorded in a Canadian port in the 1820s and published in the English press. Later, this article appeared in the St. Petersburg magazine Sunotikes in 1829 under the title "The Ship Encased in Ice." The author of the article, presumably a whaler, writes that one day, while chatting over a glass of punch about Captain Parry's last voyage 5 and the dangers of polar navigation in general, he heard a story from an old English captain named Wairns. The mariner recalled how in April 1775, they were sailing near 77 degrees north latitude, and one morning, about a mile from their ship, they saw the sea encased in ice. According to Wairns, there was nothing visible on the white horizon except mountains and jagged hills covered in snow. The wind died down, and the captain confessed that for 2 days, due to calm conditions, they were in constant fear that their ship, rendered uncontrollable by the lack of wind, would be crushed by the massive ice. The entire next day, the crew remained in suspense until around midnight, when the wind picked up, and they all heard a terrible cracking of the ice, colliding and shattering with a noise that resembled thunderclaps. As dawn broke, the crew saw the blue expanse of the ocean. People couldn't believe their eyes. The icy barrier that had pounded the ship all night broke up, forming a wide channel. The polar sun rose, and a gentle breeze filled the sails. They were saved. Suddenly, from the side of the channel, we saw the mass of a ship, recalls Wairns. What surprised us the most was that its sails were arranged in a very strange manner, and the spars and rigging seemed as if they were broken and torn. It continued to sail for a while, and then, stopping on a small ice floe, it no longer moved. The captain ordered a small boat to be lowered, and he, along with several sailors, set off for this miraculous ship. Approaching the ship, they saw that it was severely damaged by the ice. There was no one visible on the snow-covered deck. The sailors shouted from the boat, but no one answered. Approaching the ship's side, the narrator peered into an open porthole. Dear God, in the depth of the cabin, he discerned the figure of a man sitting at a table with writing instruments strewn about. Ascending to the deck, the crew opened the hatch and descended into the cabin, where they found the scribe they had observed through the porthole. But their surprise was immense when they realized that the scribe had long been frozen stiff. The scribe's eyes were open. In his hand, he held a quill, and the ship's logbook lay on the table before him. The final entry read, November 11, 1762. Now 17 days have passed since we became trapped in ice. Yesterday the fire went out, and our captain tried to kindle again, but without success. His wife died this morning. There is no longer any hope. Wairns reports that his sailors were genuinely frightened and recoiled from the lifeless body that appeared so lifelike. Beyond that was a door leading to the calming cabin. There, the sailors found the body of a woman lying on a bed. Her features displayed a look of attention mixed with fear. Wairns continues his account. One could think, seeing the freshness of her face, that she was still alive. Only the spasmodic rigidity of her limbs showed us that she had already passed away. Sitting on the floor beside her was a young man, holding a flint and steel in his frozen hands. From there, Wayans and his comrades entered the sailors' quarters, where the sailors lay in their bunks, as if alive. It seemed that a simple ring of the bell would put the crew on duty. Nearby, by the gangway, lay a dog. We searched in vain for provisions or firewood. The captain continues. There was nothing. Then my sailors began to talk about the ship being bewitched and declared to me that they would not stay on it any longer. Taking the ship's logbook, we returned to our own vessel, struck with horror, reflecting on the dire example of the dangers faced by seafarers in polar voyages at such high northern latitudes. Returning to England, Wayans submitted a report to the Admiralty about this strange ship. Thanks to the ship's name and the fact that the ship's logbook had been preserved, it was determined that the schooner had been considered lost for the past 13 years. Therefore, Wayans concludes, since it was encased in ice from that very time,
Enemy destroyer foundered.
Enemy cruiser detected. Enemy destroyer sighted.
Torpedoes, dead ahead.
Enemy cruiser detected. Enemy destroyer sighted.
Battle ends in 5 minutes.